Our Across the Aisle segment tonight. This past Sunday, more than 200 NFL players, about 23% of the league, refused to stand for the national anthem. They face away from our flag. What began as a protest by Colin Kaepernick against the liberal narrative of police brutality morphed into a protest against President Trump, just days after the president called players who refused to stand for the anthem SOBs and said team owners should not condone such behavior. The problem with the protest wasn't the players' dislike of President Trump. Most people couldn't care less about whether NFL players like or dislike the president. The problem was the players disrespected our country, our flag, and our servicemen and women just to give the middle finger to President Trump. Watch.
We have a great country. We have great people representing our country, especially our soldiers, our first responders, and they should be treated with respect. And when you get on your knee and you don't respect the American flag or the anthem, that's not being treated with respect.
Are you claiming racial tensions, sir?
No, this has nothing to do with race.
When I heard, some comments that were made recently, I kind of put it over the top a little bit. And, I don't know if it's something, I'm not sure if it's something I plan on doing every game, because my grandpa is a veteran, and I have no disrespect for that. But in terms of, what's going on recently, and, I thought today was a great opportunity to show my support.
With me now, former Georgia State Representative, Democratic strategist, LaDon Jones. LaDon, good to see you.
Hi, Liz. Good to see you again.
All right, LaDon, I'm very interested in your take on this because I think we're both patriotic people, even though we come at issues from slightly different angles much of the time. But let me start by asking you, this past weekend, it was 23% of the league, over 200 NFL players. When they took their knee and faced away from the flag during the national anthem, were they protesting police brutality or were they protesting President Trump?
I think it was a mixture for sure. This original protest started from the player Kaepernick really feeling like, America doesn't always represent his best interests. And many of the players kneeled for him or knelt with him. But there are a large number of them who were offended by what Donald Trump says. As president, him getting himself involved in a peaceful protest in such a striking way, to use such offensive language, I think it crossed both lines. We have to remember, though, this started to bring attention to the issue, and there's certainly attention on the issue now.
I actually would disagree slightly. I think at first there was a lot of discussion. You and I actually talked about it many times. Now I think that's not at all what we're talking about. Nobody this week is talking about police brutality. They're talking about patriotism, respecting the flag, and players that appear at least to be so entitled that they are disrespecting the country, which gave them this opportunity. I mean, when you look at the flag at the football game, does that represent Donald Trump to you?
Well, no, but Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and until he opened his mouth and decided to insert himself into this matter that, frankly, he could have just stayed out of, I do think that it is incumbent upon people who have a platform. I know you call them entitled because they're millionaires, but what that means is they have a platform where people will listen to them, very similar to the, I believe it was a golf player standing outside of a New York hotel who was attacked. If it were a regular black man, which happens quite often, who was addressed for doing absolutely nothing, committing no crime, people wouldn't care. But because he had a platform as a multi-million-dollar athlete, he was able to talk about the injustice in a way that caught people's attention. There's no different here with these athletes and the football players, and it's their duty to do this.
Listen, and I have no problem with that. I have no problem with people speaking their political views. Obviously, that's what you and I do on a weekly basis. I actually think it's great when people are willing to have difficult conversations and to put themselves out there to speak up for what they believe. But I take umbrage with these players when they are turning their backs on the American flag, because to me, the American flag is the one thing that unifies our country. I mean, the past, I don't even know how many years, our country has been so divided by so many different issues. The flag is the one thing that says, listen, under this flag, we're not black or brown or white. We're not Republicans, Democrats, or whatever other party. We're just Americans. And if you have an issue with a certain issue, if they have an issue with police brutality, the solution to that is not to indict the country which protects their freedom to protest, which is what they're doing when they protest the flag. It is to talk about it in a respectful manner instead of only bringing it up because you are being disrespectful to the men and women who gave their lives to give you that freedom.
But I think that the people who are protesting have made it clear that this was not intended as a disrespect to those in the military. And let's be clear, Donald Trump won his election based on him simply saying, I need to make America great again, insinuating that America isn't great. So for him now to say he is so offended because people took a stand on an issue, it's really disingenuous and hypocritical. Let's just refocus here. What the people who are protesting, whether you agree with the protest or not, is that we need to reevaluate the policies as it relates to police procedure. Right now, we have a shoot-to-kill mentality using lethal force, and that may have been fine for a time.
No,
but
that's
right
not
now,
true
our
at
police
all.
officers have.
No, that's not true at all. There are actually still
It
people.
is
I have
true.
been astounded this past week to hear people that still actually buy into the narrative that hands up, don't shoot actually happened. We have evidence, proof. We have proof, forensic analysis that says that never happened. Michael Brown was never executed when his hands were up and he was obeying the police officer. These people are buying into a false narrative. They claim they're standing up for an issue and they can't even answer simple questions. They can't answer the question of how many black men, black women were killed by police officers this year or last year? How many of those shootings were justified? How many of those shootings happened while the individual was committing a crime? How many police officers were put in jail for those crimes? How many were indicted for actually not following procedure? They're not talking about any of that. They're not proposing solutions. They're just thumbing their nose at a symbol which the majority of Americans interpret and know and love to be supportive of our troops and our liberty and our freedom.
Well, let me pose this to you, Liz. So what we're really good at is coming to a middle ground. So your narrative is that these things never happen. My narrative is we hear about it all the time. And
no, I never said it never happened.
A few
I said
cases.
There's not widespread extermination of black people by police officers with impunity. The data shows it's not widespread. Of course it happens sometimes, and we condemn it when it happens, but it's not widespread.
Okay, so let's talk about those times that it does happen, because police officers are sworn to protect and serve. And if you ask any police officer, they'll tell you that they are taught and trained to shoot to kill. Now, when we watch television, which we know is fake, many times you see the officers disable. They do what is necessary, only using the force to make the person compel and follow instructions. In the cases where police officers are shooting people in the back, in the case where they're shooting people who do not have a firearm, when they're shooting people who may have a weapon, but they're not within, not a firearm, but a gun, such as the Georgia Tech student who was here in Georgia and shot with lethal force. What we are asking as protesters, not to focus on the flag, a knee, or Trump, but can we come up with a policy that encourages our police officers to be retrained not to shoot to kill when it is not necessary, when deadly force is not needed? If we can agree on that issue, it doesn't matter who kneels.
Right, I don't have a problem with that. And I don't have a problem with reevaluating this stuff. There's actually a study that shows that police do use non-lethal force in a greater percentage on black people than white people. And I think that's a problem. It clearly indicates that it has to do with race, and we need to look into that. But if you look at the statistics of how often police shoot black people in the midst of these situations versus the percentage of white people, police are actually more likely to shoot a white suspect who has not attacked first than a black suspect who has not attacked first. And it seems to me that these people are just blatantly ignoring that. To your point, though, let me ask you, why do police officers shoot? When they actually use their firearms, what is the justification? What are their standards? Why do they shoot their gun?
Well, many of the officers claim that they were in fear that the person may have had a firearm or that the person wouldn't comply. But here's a scenario. No. They cannot be judge, jury, and executioner out there. When they shoot, if there is a possibility, they have on armor, they have advanced training. If they can shoot to disable and bring, if the person is a criminal, before the judicial system to be determined guilty, that is just a better scenario, whether you're black, white, or otherwise.
No, that puts police officers in danger. That's not correct. That's not correct. It's not accurate to say that police officers shoot when someone won't comply. They use their firearms only when there is reasonable belief, not reasonable as an individual reasoning, reasonable as in the collective force of police officers in our nation would agree that it is reasonable to believe that they are in harm's way, that there is a reasonable belief that their life is at risk. They do not shoot or use their firearms unless there is reasonable belief that their life is at risk. To quote unquote shoot to disable, first of all, I don't think that that's a realistic prospect anyway. I'm not sure that police officers even are good enough with firearms, with all due respect, to engage that. But shooting to disable wouldn't necessarily protect police officers if a suspect was trying to attack them and hurt them and kill them.
If But if they're not, then we can save a life, both the police officer and the person on the street. And here's the last thing I'll say about Liz. You know, I don't want to, unfortunately, I believe your experiences are very different from the African-American experience, which is why race gets involved. See, when we talk about excessive force, we're not only talking about the people who died. Many of us, me included, have parents, fathers, husbands who have been pulled to the side of the road. Far more force than necessary has been used, and they come home to us. They don't go to jail. They haven't committed a crime. When you hear those stories again and again over generations, and then someone tries to convince you that there's not a problem with excessive force, you have a hard time believing it. Right. Now, there may not have been many people in your community or in your family who had those experiences.
You don't need to disrespect my experience. I actually said earlier in the segment that I agree. I read that study too. There's empirical evidence that shows police use more force on black people when it's non-lethal force. And I said it seems to have to do with race, and we should address that. My problem with this, and they're telling me that I have to wrap, we're much over time here, is that these players, these NFL players, when they take their knee, when they disrespect the flag, they're not having the conversation that you and I are having. They're not looking at the facts and the data, pointing to a specific problem and asking for a solution. They're just simply disrespecting the flag.